he said he was very firmly a Protestant Christian, and he was very firmly going to be the defender of the faith. So all that has to be processed. Now, whether that will actually affect anything in this great fight for Western civilization that Britain, like America, is now engaged in, is another matter.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today we have an important conversation with columnist Melanie Phillips about life in Britain and the ongoing struggle to defend Western civilization. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. There's something about monarchy that appeals to a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise want to live in one themselves. That's part of the reason why so many people remain fascinated by the British royal family and the fact that the Netflix show The Crown, the soap opera loosely based on their real lives, remains a hit, despite or perhaps because of so much of it is fiction. This past weekend's coronation of King Charles and Queen Camilla was the latest installment in the real-life version of the soap opera, and millions tuned in around the world to watch the ceremonies. Yet even in what was a somewhat ordered-down version with nods towards egalitarianism and even religious pluralism that would have been unthinkable during previous coronations a long time ago, the event still had a great power that transcended the mundane. While the coronation may seem to many like a live theme park show that has little relevance to 21st century republicans and democracy, there's more here than even a Republican with a small r ought to appreciate. The point about it is that the use of symbols and traditions that connect the present to the past lends inherent legitimacy to nations and their government systems. That was one of the profound insights of 18th century English thinker and statesman Edmund Burke in his defense of the English Constitution and his critique of the destruction of tradition and societal norms during the French Revolution. And it applies to us today, whether we follow the royal soap opera or not. This matters not so much because of the ability of the British monarchy to survive when so many others fell by the wayside in the maelstrom of the 20th century, at a time when the left's war on Western civilization is running roughshod over traditional values, as well as the study of the great achievements of the past. The English monarchy is relevant because it demonstrates that the effort to preserve a national identity and a unified culture isn't necessarily a lost cause, even in the age of rampant wokeness. Despite the growth of executive power, Americans neither need nor want a king, and our polarized, bifurcated political culture seems to have rendered the ceremonies around which the life of the Republic used to center, like inaugurations, as no longer having the power to move us across party lines. But what Americans do desperately need is a return to a more unified culture in which national values like patriotism and reverence for the achievements of the founders and the importance of faith and family are returned to a position of respect rather than constantly torn down as discredited relics of a bygone age. The nihilism of the neo-Marxist revolutionary spirit that seeks to tear down Western civilization and devalue the great works of philosophy, history, literature, and religion, as well as our political structures, is doing enormous damage to American society. In its place, the left elevates racialist ideologies about intersectionality and critical race theory that create a permanent race conflict and grants a permanent permission slip to anti-Semitism. The DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, woke catechism that seeks to replace the values of equality and a colorblind society with its own Marxist nightmare vision is a deadly threat to both the West and freedom. How that threat will be effectively answered in a society where the organs of culture, journalism, and the academy are effectively mobilized against us is an open question. But the one thing we do know is that the only answer for those who can is to keep speaking up, and for those who seek political influence to understand what time it is, and to realize that this culture war for the West isn't just an important issue, it's the only issue. All this raises important questions about the future. But in the meantime, we also have to wonder whether, despite the unity he symbolizes, someone like King Charles, who has long been known for his views on a number of issues, can actually play a role in being a bulwark for preserving Britain or standing up against the forces of the left that legitimize anti-Semitism. To discuss all this and more, I'm very happy to welcome back to Top Story one of my favorite columnists and someone I'm proud to call a colleague and a member of the JNS team. Melanie Phillips is a British journalist, broadcaster, and author who has championed traditional values in the culture war for more than 3 decades. She writes a weekly column in the Times of London as well as for JNS and regularly broadcasts on the BBC. Her first novel, The Legacy, was published in 2018, along with a personal and political memoir, Guardian Angel. Previous books include the 2006 bestseller Londonistan, about the British establishment's capitulation to Islam, Islamist aggression, and The World Turned Upside Down, the global battle over God, truth, and power, published in 2010. In addition to reading her on JNS, you can follow Melanie's work on her website, melaniephillips.substack.com. Melanie Phillips, welcome back to Top Story.
Hello, Jonathan. Very good to be with you again.
Yes, well, it's great to have you, Melanie. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start by asking you about the television show from Britain that a lot of people watched this past weekend. The Coronation of King Charles seemed, at least to me, to be a reminder of the power of symbols of tradition and national unity. You've been a strong critic of the way British elites, including at times Charles, have bent their knees to woke leftist doctrines, undermining both British unity and, in many ways, the foundations of Western civilization. What were your impressions of the ceremony, and whether it is something that really resonates in terms of the ongoing fight to save that country and the West?
Well, that last question, the jury is very much out, not least because we don't really know how the king is going to conduct himself as the new monarch. In terms of the coronation itself, it was a remarkable spectacle, and remarkable, I think, to many people watching in Britain, let alone around the world, not just because it's been 70 years since anyone saw a coronation, which was the king's late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, but because very few people in Britain, let alone around the world, understand that at the core of the coronation itself is a religious ceremony, an anointment, which in fact goes back to the Israelite kings of antiquity, is consciously patterned on them, and it is a vow that the monarch takes to God, which sets him apart from politics and indeed from ordinary people. He consecrates himself to a divine task. He makes an oath to God, to serve God, and to serve God by serving his people. So it is literally an unbreakable bond of the highest possible degree of sanctity. And in a post-religious society, which is what Britain now is, people have no idea about this and don't really understand or rate it. But they, I think, nevertheless, once they see it, once they saw it on the video, on the recording or the live coverage, I think that very few will have failed to have been moved and touched and impressed in a way that possibly they can't really describe or don't want to acknowledge, because it is a very religious ceremony and it is a very Christian ceremony. And what's very interesting is that, Britain is now a country of many cultures, many minority faiths, but it is still fundamentally a Christian country, even though a majority of the Brits no longer profess Christianity. Christianity is embedded in the culture of Britain. And so if one rates and values what that culture is, one has to rate and acknowledge the contribution made to that culture, a foundational contribution by Christianity. Nevertheless, there are many minority faiths. And when he was Prince of Wales, the king caused alarm in traditional circles by saying that when he was crowned, he wanted to be not the defender of the faith, which is Protestant Christianity, but the defender of faith. This is because the king has a long-standing belief in what he describes as the harmony of all creation. So he doesn't actually believe there are any differences between faiths, between Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, and all the rest. He doesn't believe there are any significant differences which should divide anybody. And consequently, he doesn't see the need to defend anyone against anything. And that alarmed people, including the Jewish community in Britain, which in America you may find this a little strange to understand because America does not have an established faith. But in Britain, the Jewish community has always believed that the umbrella of kind of milk and water Christianity, which is what Church of England is, actually safeguards them as a minority community. Absent that, it is feared group would fight group. So there was concern that the king would not be the defender of the faith. As it happened, as it turned out, he said he was very firmly a Protestant Christian, and he was very firmly going to be the defender of the faith. So all that has to be processed. Now, whether that will actually affect anything in this great fight for Western civilization that Britain, like America, is now engaged in, is another matter. Opinion polling suggests that younger people, by which I mean anybody under about 40, they don't really rate the monarchy. They don't really care much about it. They're not passionately against it, but they're not passionately for it either. They have a very poor understanding of Britain, its history, its institutions, why they're important, and similarly a very poor understanding of what is valuable in the West that is now under such an onslaught and is in danger of being eroded or lost. So it's a moot point whether this is going to change very much from that point of view, and much depends on how the king chooses to comport himself.
Yeah, I think, that brings to mind a couple of different things for me, because that's a fascinating explanation. I brought to watching the ceremony, or at least as much of it as I did, I was reminded of the writings of Edmund Burke, the 18th century statesman and and writer, not as familiar, to I think contemporary Americans, let alone Israelis, but he believed deeply in the power of tradition, that the legitimacy of a state is rooted in its connection to tradition, to law, to the culture. And I think that was very much embodied by the coronation, that this was the legitimacy of the British state, the British Constitution on display in all of its splendor. I had to wonder whether that would, sort of resonate for people, even those who had never heard of or read Burke, or understood the way, as you say, understood their own country in Britain, or at least even from the outside.
It's too early to say. I mean, the coronation was only a few days ago, and everybody, I think, who watched it really enjoyed the spectacle. Nobody could fail to be impressed by the spectacle. I mean, it's what Britain does better than anyone else in the world. It does pomp, and especially military pomp. So we don't know what lasting impact it's going to have. I have to say I'm a little pessimistic because the tradition, I mean, certainly what you say is absolutely crucial. Tradition is everything. The passing on of the inherited culture, its traditions, its laws, its religious settlement, and so on. A culture cannot exist unless those things are passed on. And in the last several decades, we in Britain, and I think it's not so dissimilar from you in America, in the last few decades, Britain has undergone a transformation of its education system, a very explicit turning away from the understanding of education as the transmission of a culture down through the generations to a belief that that culture is innately illegitimate because it's white, it's Western, it's colonialist, it's imperialist, it's oppressive. All those things apparently go together in the most fashionable orthodoxies, which are now and have been the orthodoxies in the education system for decades. And so, you know, if this is not being transmitted, then the monarchy is fighting, it's the labor of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill. And I'm afraid the boulder is about to, is showing signs of coming down the hill and taking the monarchy with it. Mm-hmm. Now, much depends. I mean, the Church of England is quite frankly hopeless. It is the established church.
Yeah.
It no longer functions as a religious institution. And I realize I'm giving offense in saying this, and it's too exaggerated, because there are priests and vicars of the church who do transmit godly virtues. But by and large, the higher echelons of the Church of England long ago decided to go down the road pioneered by the World Council of Churches and turn Christianity from being a set of religious beliefs into a kind of social justice mechanism based on, in terms of the World Council of Churches, liberation theology. And that's hopeless because it doesn't give people what they crave, which is spiritual nourishment. So there's no leadership in the Church of England in this dreadfully important task of saving the West. The education system, as I said just now, has abandoned its task of transmitting that culture. The family, the traditional family, the mother, father, children, bringing up, mother or father bringing up their own children, has long in Britain been regarded as being an affront to people who don't live like that. And so it's no longer promoted at all. If you promote it, you are considered to be a bigot of some kind. And so the building blocks that are so vital to underpin the transmission of tradition have been eroded to the point of disappearance. Now, not all is lost. There is a movement, beginnings of a movement in Britain to say something has gone terribly wrong with conservatism. You mentioned, Jonathan, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is credited with having founded conservatism as a defense of the most precious values of civilization against what were then the depredations of the French Revolution. Now,
exactly.
Where I'm sitting from, we're living through the French Revolution all over again. It's very, very similar, not least in the sense that the revolutionaries proceed to eat their own. So, what was considered extreme last week is now considered so hideously not extreme that those people have to be cancelled and so on. It is an all-out onslaught, just as the French Revolution was, against these settled traditions of the civilization of the West, and an attempt to replace it by an abstract set of values, which in those days, in the French Revolution time, was called, the age of reason. And now, it seems to me, the equivalent of the age of reason is actually the age of unreason, in which we have ideologies that are based on the idea that, we must get rid of biblical morality because that is irrational, it's superstitious, it's ill-educated and so on, and replace it by ideologies made by mankind, which must be reasonable and rational. But in fact, they're not reasonable and rational for this reason, because they don't admit or permit any dissent whatsoever. And consequently, if you bring evidence to bear to show that this ideology or that ideology is wrong, it doesn't correspond to reality, you are told that that evidence is not evidence at all, it is simply evidence of bigotry. So if you can't admit to the evidence of what's actually reality, what's actually in the real world, then you are actually repudiating reason. So it seems to me that we're in a kind of French Revolution going backwards, that instead of the age of reason, we are living through a revolution to impose the age of unreason. So this is very, very, very alarming. But there are some people, I'm taking part in a conference next week in London, where I currently am. As it happens, for that conference, I'm speaking at a conference, which is to do with how in Britain we can, or the British can, rescue conservatism. And this is part of a train of thought which has been pioneered by the writer and thinker Yoram Hazony, who I'm sure you know. He calls it national conservatism, which some of us think it sounds a bit like National Socialism. We don't much like that phrase, but I understand exactly what he means. That
we'll just call it the Edmund Burke Foundation, which the
Edmund Burke Foundation, indeed. But the point of it is that that conservatism has become detached from the promotion of the nation. The nation is the upholder, promoter, and defense of all the values that we hold dear. Without the nation, as a functioning nation, you can't do that. That's why the coronation is so important, or was so important. That's why the monarchy in Britain's terms, I realize it's different in America, but in Britain's terms, the coronation and the monarchy is so important, because the monarch is the embodiment of the nation in Britain. If you value, the nation of the United Kingdom, going back all those hundreds of years, then you must value the monarchy, which is the embodiment and the sort of foundation of that nation. But in recent years, Britain, like in America and like in other parts of the West, the people who actually dominate the culture in Britain have adopted the orthodoxy. The Western nation is, as I said before, illegitimate, racist, colonialist, and all the rest of that rubbish. And consequently, they're knocking away the foundations that the monarchy actually sits on, even while they are, gasping at the magnificence and poignant meaning and importance of the coronation ceremony.
Yes, I think that's all very, that's very much on point. Obviously, civilization rests on these traditions, and without them, there is no nation, there is no culture, and indeed the revolutionaries, as you rightly say, are, they're rejecting the Enlightenment.
Exactly.
Age of Unreason. They,
exactly.
Specifically rejecting the entire heritage of the West, of Athens and Jerusalem, and of, the great philosophic works that are the foundation of our freedom, of everything that we used to value and still should.
Well, precisely, and it's a great
I want to
irony.
go back for a moment.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. I want to go back for a moment where you said about Charles and his, defender of the faith or defender of faith. Now, of course, at the coronation, there were representatives of other faiths. playing small supporting roles, which is, of course, would have been unthinkable in the past, but that was in tune with his sort of multicultural approach. And indeed, there was a Jewish representative there too. Is that something that should provide comfort, or is that part of the sort of deracination of the system?
No, it wasn't. It's certainly not the deracination of the system. There was concern that, as I said before, that the king would insist on having a multicultural coronation. In other words, dethroning Christianity. Now, as you may have seen, it was an eye-wateringly Christian service. I mean, really, full on. However, I think an appropriate note was struck by the very conscious attempt to bring in other faiths, as you said, in small supporting roles. In other words, the core of the thing remained inviolate. It was a Christian communion service. But other faiths were invited to take part round the edges. So there were representatives of other faiths who were presenting various ceremonial items that were used during the service. And the chief rabbi in Britain and his equivalents in the Sikh and Hindu and Muslim communities, and maybe someone else, I can't quite remember, but they gathered at the very end of the event when the king was processing out, having been crowned. He paused and they gave him a blessing. And that, I think, was a very appropriate and sensitive and tactful way of acknowledging the presence in the country and the importance to the country of minority faith communities, while not interfering with the core of the coronation ritual, which is a Christian ritual.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about sort of the role of Jews in Britain. Where do you see the current state of Britain with respect to anti-Semitism? Keir Starmer, the head of the Labour Party, seems to have routed Jeremy Corbyn, his predecessor, and his supporters from the Labour leadership. And, if polls are right, he appears to be on track to be leading the left back to power at the next election. But is British Jewry, feeling secure about everything now that that Corbyn has been marginalized, at least to some extent? Was that just a nightmare? It's gone away, or are the problems still sort of baked into the system, as you say, with elites and with this war on civilization in which the Jews are always a target?
From where I'm sitting, and I'm normally sitting in Jerusalem, not in London, it's a nightmare that continues to unfold, and the British Jewish community continues to basically be like the little child who puts his or her hands over the ears and says, no, I'm not listening. The Corbyn thing was an overt nightmare, and the British Jews got up and shouted about it. In my cynical view, that wasn't so difficult because Corbyn was genuinely accepted as being a completely far-out politician, regarded by the majority of Brits as being completely unsuitable and a traitor to his country. Many Brits thought that. So it was like low-hanging fruit, quite frankly. Along comes Keir Starmer, decent man, married to a Jewish woman, genuinely wants to rid the Labour Party of this terrible stain. But whether he understands this or not, I don't know, but he can't do it because anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred is now rampant, open and brazen throughout the progressive Western world, in Britain no less than anywhere else. So it continues in the Labour Party. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has gone to some lengths to rid the party of its most obvious anti-Semites. And he's done that with great fanfare and drama and made sure everybody understands that's what he was doing. And that's, all to the good. No problem with that at all. All credit to him. However, he's left a lot of people still in place. And you may have seen a recent uproar over somebody who was an aficionado, a comrade of Corbyn, Diane Abbott, who remains a kind of grande dame of the Labour Party. And she came out with a ridiculous and hideously inappropriate and prejudiced statement that, in fact, no white person could be the victim of racism, and Jews couldn't be the victim of racism, and that Jews were like and gypsies and others who were not black had no worse experience than in terms of prejudice than people who had red hair. There was a tremendous row, not just because it was so stupid, but because Diane Abbott had a history of supporting Corbyn attitudes towards Israel and the Middle East, which are hostile to Israel's behavior, to put it mildly, unfair, distorted, demonized Israel. She's on that side of that argument. And she also has gone to enormous lengths to deny that Corbyn and his ilk were in any way complicit in presiding over the outburst or the tsunami of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Now, if you deny it, then you basically go along with it. You basically, in some way, you believe it. You believe the lies. So, this is what's in the Labour Party. And Starmer immediately, as soon as this row happened, he stripped her of the Labour whip, which means she is still sitting as a member of Parliament, but not as a member of the Labour Party in Parliament. She's not a Labour MP, she's an independent MP. However, well, this may sound a little complicated, she remains a member of the Labour Party. She's not been thrown out of the Labour Party, even though she's been stripped of the whip. And it's like a suspension. Now, people like me think she should be slung out. That's it, finish, over. But no. So, there's a lot of this still going on. And in terms of, attitudes to Israel which go far, far beyond criticism, as you know, there's nothing to do with proper criticism. It's to do with demonization and delegitimization. That is still absolutely rampant. On British streets, Jews are being beaten up. They are, just like in America, the people who are bearing the physical brunt, most of the physical brunt of this, tend to be the most obviously Jewish. In other words, the Haredim. And they are kind of invisible because nobody wants to acknowledge them. In the Jewish community doesn't want really to acknowledge them either. So no one is sort of jumping up and down the whole time. And the Haredim, as you may well know, they're people who tend not to jump up and down themselves. They want to draw more attention to themselves. They kind of accept that this is how it is and how it was and how it always will be, and they just get on with their lives. So that's not very helpful either. But that's going on. And there's a huge amount of what I would call social anti-Semitism, which is overt. When I was growing up, it wasn't overt. That sort of anti-Semitism, which is baked into British society, into British history, that's a long story. But nevertheless, when I was growing up and in my earlier years, really until I would say, I don't know, the 70s, anti-Semitism was confined to the social fringes, and it was viewed with absolute disapproval, and people were regarded as like lunatics if they believed, in Jewish conspiracy theory and that kind of thing. And now it's like normal. It's denormalized. And it's a terrible thing. So the organized Jewish community, the Jewish community leadership, as far as they're concerned, they occasionally express some concern, like over Diane Abbott in the Labour Party. But by and large, the Jewish community thinks that it's now safe to go back to voting Labour again. They are always keen to blind themselves, I'm afraid, to the reality, to put their heads in the sand. And so, it's perfectly possible to be a British Jew, to live in a Jewish area, to have Jewish friends, and not really to come across all this, especially if you're the kind of British Jew for whom Israel is either irrelevant to your life, you don't care about it, you don't think about it, you kind of tune it out, or increasingly this is so, and I know this is even more so in America, increasingly British Jews kind of believe the lies they're told by the BBC and by the mainstream media about Israel. And consequently, if you're in that kind of zone that you're tuning out what's coming at you from the BBC, from mainstream media, from social discourse, which you don't ever encounter because you don't encounter those sorts of people, it's perfectly possible. I think there's nothing much wrong with being a British Jew at the moment. Not my perspective. Absolutely not my perspective.
Yeah. As much as the UK political establishment has bought into a lot of fashionable leftist ideology, there have been signs that the trans craze, for one, is getting some pushback there in ways that it isn't, say, in the United States and from the Biden administration, which has championed it.
Right.
Where do you see that issue in particular in Europe right now?
Well, in Europe, I don't know. In Britain, there is certainly pushback. The current government is quite good on this. I say quite good because, in my view, they could be much stronger. But anyway, they set up an inquiry into the main, very prestigious psychiatric unit that was actually channeling young people in great psychological distress that were coming to them, suffering from a whole range of issues, including autism and eating disorders and suicidal depression. They were channeling them into permanent body-changing procedures to do with transgender. And the government got very, very, very alarmed. It's a conservative government. It got very alarmed and it shut down this psychiatric facility. Unfortunately, the practitioners there are signs the practitioners are reassembling in a more diversified way. And that's because the culture itself hasn't been properly addressed and hasn't been properly stamped out, in my view. So the government is certainly doing more than is happening in the States, but not enough. There is certainly pushback among parents, among a lot of ordinary members of the public, and that's putting pressure on the government to do more. So there is a certain amount of pushback on the transgender stuff. But on the other great battleground in the culture wars, in the identity politics culture wars, which is race, there's no pushback. There's no pushback. You've got this extraordinary situation in which you have black racism, which you have in America, in which anyone who is white, the entire, population of white people in the world, is considered innately prejudiced and racist and colonialist and exploitative, and all white people have to do penance for being white. I mean, this is you can't get a greater example of racial prejudice than that, and that is now the orthodoxy, not just in the universities, the wretched universities from where all this basically comes. But even in, and not just in NGOs and fashionable institutions of the culture, but also in business. They've all internalized it. And, well, not all, but a lot of them have internalized it. And this is a staggering thing, and this is not being pushed back against properly at all. And, you come back to, I'm afraid, the new king. The new king has said that he wants an inquiry into the historic association of the British monarchy with slavery. Now, I'm sorry, but, if you've got a monarch taking that position, then it is a really bad omen. Because, okay, the British monarchy was involved in slavery. I mean, everyone's involved. It was involved in slavery at one point. The point about Britain, like America, is that they got rid of it. And, the idea that slavery was a uniquely white phenomenon is a lie. And today, slavery is being practiced around the world, not in white society. So this is a terrible, racially prejudiced calumny. And unless our leaders in Britain and America, our political leaders, our religious leaders, our cultural leaders, unless they actually stand up and say, this is a lie, it is a distortion, it is itself bigotry, unless they call it out for what it is, then it's not going to be addressed. And I think the same with transgender. There are people standing up saying, a woman is, it is a biological fact that a woman is a woman, but not enough, and not at a high enough level. And certainly not enough people are standing up saying what is being done to children under the guise of transgender is child abuse. Okay, there are people who have a specific problem of that kind, but they, in terms of numbers, it is statistically minuscule. The vast majority of these children need other kinds of help, and to channel them in this direction is a form of child abuse. And so unless you say that, you're going to continue to have practitioners, as I've just described, who, okay, the institution that was doing all this, the main institution's been shut down, but they're still there, and they're still going to be practicing this ideology on other children under the radar somewhere. So if you're going to turn around the culture, you've actually got to stand up and be counted by actually calling it out for what it is, and calling out the people who are pushing it for what they are.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And what you say about Britain and slavery, if you're going to call out Britain for, sort of its bad past, why can't you give credit to Britain for what it did was good? Because, of course, Britain, it's not well known, certainly here in the United States, and I don't know if British people know their own history, but Britain banned slavery a generation before America did, and actually the Royal Navy spent the 19th century fighting the slave trade.
Exactly.
Shedding blood to do so. So it's kind of crazy for Britain to be flagellating itself over that. But let me turn to, one of your great books, and it's been 17 years since your book Londonistan was published. Obviously, much of what you warned about in terms of Britain and Europe has already come to pass. But I want to ask, whether a Brit that is being led by the children of immigrants who have assimilated into British society, whether in the form of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the son of Indian immigrants, or somewhat remarkably to me that even the head of the Scottish Nationalist Party in the Scottish Parliament, Humza Yousaf, was the son of Pakistani immigrants and a Muslim. Has Britain become a truly multicultural society in the way that, as opposed to a, sort of an ethnic, group, and where with some small minorities, is much like the United States is a multicultural society, always has been. What does that mean for its future as a Western democracy?
It's not a multicultural society. It's a society which has a lot more, many more immigrants from very different cultures than it once had. That's true. London is very different from everywhere else in the country. London is it's been described as a kind of modern version of the Athenian city-state. It's a sort of separate entity. It's demographically quite different from the rest of the country. I think it's something getting over half of its population. I can't remember the statistic, maybe a bit more than half, something like that, is ethnic minority. That's not true elsewhere in the country. There are pockets where there are, particular denominations, particular ethnic minorities are numerous and becoming more numerous because they're having more children, particularly the Muslim community, because white Britain is not reproducing itself. So that is a demographic and statistical fact. The fact that Britain now has a Hindu prime minister and other Asian people of Asian immigrant descent in the government is very encouraging. Interestingly, the Labour Party has very few. It's a very white party. It's the Conservative Party, which has been, minority ethnic communities have become politically socially mobile, which is strange and interesting. But I think, Britain, again, it's unlike other countries, unlike, I think, America. I hope I don't give offense by saying this, but it's very, very much more tolerant of ethnic difference. This, the idea that Britain is a racist country, for Britain, it is such a terrible lie. It is the opposite of the truth. Britain is the British are very accepting. I'll come on to Jews in a minute. I'll put Jews to one side. But in terms of people of different skin colour, it's been decades since we noticed that there was a significant number of brown and black skinned people marrying white skinned people, and it's now completely commonplace. It hardly raises an eyebrow at all. There are lots and lots of coffee-coloured children running around, or adults, and it's like normal. And I think this does speak to the really open-hearted nature of indigenous British culture. It's not exclusive. It is very, very tolerant. It's intolerant of certain things, which where people feel that their backs are being put to the wall, then it becomes quite militant. But on things like skin color, it's very pragmatic. I mean, it's as what's the big deal? When it comes to Jews, it's different, and that's because of the place of Jews in Western culture. And if you're an educated person in Britain, and you are brought up in Christianity, and you have been exposed to the greats of English literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, down to T.S. Eliot and lots more, you come up against Christianity-based theological antisemitism, Dickens, Fagin, and all that. And these are stereotypes like baked in, and people didn't even know they're baked in. So I'm afraid when people on the left, and it is particularly the left now, who say, Jews run capitalism and run the politics of America and the West, and run all these banks and so on and so forth. When you point out to these people that is anti-Semitism, classic, undiluted anti-Semitism, they are genuinely astonished because they know anti-Semitism is a prejudice and is bad, but they think that what they think about Jews is true because it's ingrained in the culture. Now, so this is a big problem. It's not true of everybody, but it is around. So to that extent, the British are, it's not a good thing. But in terms of people of brown or black skins, it's a great thing, really. When Rishi Sunak became leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, there was a lot of unhappiness, but there's unhappiness about him and what he was perceived to stand for in terms of his values and his politics, not about his skin color.
Interesting. Yeah. Obviously, you've written a lot about how the Conservatives, the Tories in Britain, are not so conservative anymore, at least most of them. But there have been some clear signs that nationalist parties on the right in Europe are on the rise, and though they're often characterized as fascist, whether in Italy or in Hungary, their popularity seems to rest on a willingness to sort of stand up for their national identity against those forces pushing for mass immigration, at least, and as well as leftist and anti-Western values. Where do you think people like Giorgia Meloni in Italy and Viktor Orban stand in today's Europe? And are they, as the left labels them, outliers, or are they to some extent a harbinger of the future?
I think it's very hard to generalize. And I mean, to be honest, I haven't studied either of them in sufficient detail to be able to really give an authoritative opinion. Viktor Orban seems to have made in his mind, a virtue out of being an illiberal liberal. And Meloni doesn't seem to me to be an illiberal liberal at all, really. she seems, she's considered to be a neo-fascist because she wants to stop unlimited immigration into her country. Orban is considered to be a neo-fascist because he wants to stop unlimited Muslim immigration. Now, certainly in Britain, and I speak from personal experience. So you mentioned kindly my book Londonistan, which was specifically about the dangers of the British establishment genuflecting to Muslim permitting the Islamization of Britain, the Balkanization of Britain, and the Islamization of parts of Britain. And I believe that is a process that continues to accelerate. We can't talk about that. I can't talk about it without being pilloried all over again as being an Islamophobe, including, I have to say, by the British Jewish leadership, for whom no criticism can be permitted of the Muslim community. So there is no mention of the tremendously high rate of Muslim anti-Semitism in Britain and across the world, which is playing a key role in fomenting the tsunami of anti-Semitism. And they didn't invent it, but nevertheless, it's playing a key role. So this is very unfortunate, to put it mildly. We can't identify the threat. Now, Meloni identified the threat. Orban has identified a threat. I believe those threats are real. I don't think they're exaggerated. And I think Europe needs to defend itself against them and is not, because it won't even talk about it. What has it got to defend itself against? Not against immigrants. Immigration within limits is good. It helps a country in all kinds of ways. It makes it more dynamic, more productive. It brings in all kinds of values that the country needs. That's fine. But if you have a large number of people coming in to your country who actually don't want to assimilate into it, but want it to assimilate to them, then you've got a problem. And if you have, in addition and separately to that, but there's a crossover, if you have such enormous numbers coming in from very different cultures that the country simply can't accommodate them, which is what's been happening in Britain, and not just different cultures, but just sheer numbers of people. I mean, Britain cannot, Britain has a tremendous housing shortage. It's public services, its schools, its family doctor services are overwhelmed simply by the numbers coming in. It's unsustainable. If you say that, you are considered a racist. If you say there is a problem with a very large numbers of the Muslim community not accepting British and Western mores, even though very large numbers do accept them, if you say that too many don't, you are considered a racist. You can't say it. Now, as far as I can see, Meloni is trying to hold the line. You cannot have a nation, a Western nation, that ceases to be able to function according to its own culture, and you cannot have a nation of any kind that loses control of its borders, as you are experiencing in America. If you don't have control of your borders, you don't have a nation. And if you don't have a nation, you cannot defend the culture and the values of that nation. It's simple. And so, to the extent to which Orban and Meloni are responding to a real threat, I think, yeah, it is a real threat. Do I approve of everything that they're doing? As I say, I don't know enough. I don't like some of the things that Orban is doing in terms of law and the centralized power over the legal system. This strikes me as illiberal, and I don't like that. But is it necessary in his circumstances? I mean, I'm speaking to you from Britain. I spend most of my time in Jerusalem. These places have, put it mildly, their own problems. Hungary is a different country. It has different pressures, different political pressures, which, we don't have in Israel, we don't have in Britain, and you don't have in America. So, you have to look at the whole context. But I'll just give you one anecdote, just to put this in a little bit of context. Some years ago, I got involved as a journalist in commenting on the tremendous battle being waged by the education standards authority here against the ultra-Orthodox schools in Britain on the basis that they were forcing them to teach homosexuality. And these are schools that don't teach sexuality at all. So, in my view, it was very much an issue of the freedom of a liberal society has to give a minority faith the power to live according to its own religious values, unless those values actually contradict the core values of that society. Now, in my view, the Haredim pose no threat to anybody, and their children are exemplars of, good civic behaviour. They don't get into trouble. They're not into drugs. They don't do crime. So anyway, it was that sort of set of issues. But the point I'm making is this. That struggle still continues as it happens. So the point I'm making is this, that at the time, the Haredim, they would be beyond upset about all this and regarded it as an absolute threat to their freedom to practice their religion, which is key to a liberal society, a real liberal society. And they said, if this continues, we're going to leave. And I said, oh, okay, which country are you going to go to? And you know what they said? Hungary. They said Hungary is the only country in Europe where we will be safe. Interesting, isn't it?
Interesting. Speaking of Europe, right now it seems the entire focus of both British and American foreign policy is the war between Russia and Ukraine, to the point, and as we mentioned, the coronation, Mrs. Biden and her granddaughter attended the coronation dressed in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. More than a year into the war, what do you think about this and the ongoing efforts of both the Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Biden administration to continue to try to further involve Israel in the war, despite its complicated relationship with Russia, as well as the other complication being the involvement of Iran in helping Moscow?
Well, I thought you were going to say, should the West continue to support Ukraine? And I'm very clear in my mind it should. This thing has to be won. We cannot afford to have it lost. And I know that has
what would constitute a victory for Ukraine?
What indeed?
That's my question, because a victory over a nuclear power, what does that mean? Is it about where the borders of Ukraine have to be set? Does Ukraine have to get back sovereignty over every inch of land it had in 2014 for that to constitute a victory? Or would a peace settlement involving some compromise, but which would guarantee Ukrainian independence, would that constitute what you think would be a win for the West?
If there's any consolidation, legitimization, and acceptance of Putin's grab of territory, that would not be a success. That would not be a good outcome. He has to be seen to have failed in his endeavor. So what does that look like? Well, it means he has to stop attacking Ukraine. It means that he cannot encroach anymore. I mean, would victory mean getting back Crimea? I can see why Crimea would be a good thing for Ukraine, and I can see also why, in terms of kind of military strategy, it makes sense. But I would say it's not crucial to the defeat of Putin. I mean, he has to be from the moment that he aggressed against Ukraine, that what he gained has to be got back. I would say that is a kind of minimum. But I'm aware this is really difficult and really complicated. However, the point about Israel, I think, is a quite separate point. Israel is as you know, is in a very, very difficult and complicated position. Israel has always supped with the devil. It has to. Because I'm afraid the angels don't want to know. So Israel has to sup with the devil if it's going to survive. And survival is everything. And, it plays this game with Russia as it plays a game with other dreadful regimes. And I don't think it can be criticized for that. Zelensky tries it on with Israel in a rather unpleasant way, I think, because, as far as he's concerned, and I understand where he's coming from, he's not interested in the difficulties of Israel. He's interested in his country, and his country's survival, and it needs what Israel has. Israel has very good reason for not giving it to him. It will do what it can to help, but it won't go any further, and that has to be respected. As for the Biden administration, the Biden administration's hostility to Israel is unspeakable, and as far as I'm concerned, the pressure it's putting on via Ukraine is part of that existential hostility that it's displaying. So that is, again, a separate issue. These are all sort of separate issues. But on the key thing about Ukraine, should there be a settlement? If you compromise with an aggressor, you lose. It's as simple as that. There is no compromise with an aggressor. You have to win. You have to defeat him. What that defeat looks like is a difficult question to answer, but you basically have to defeat him. Once you compromise, it's over, and you've empowered other bad people.
All right. Western Europe right now has, along with the United States, seems to have taken sides in the internal battle in Israel over judicial reform. I guess one obvious question is, does anyone in Europe actually care about the power of the Israeli Supreme Court? Or does it just want, like most of the Israeli protesters and the Biden administration, to topple Netanyahu and anathematize him and his right-wing allies like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir?
Oh, well, the people I know in Britain who support the protesters in Israel, like the protesters in Israel, they have many different agendas. Some of them just hate Netanyahu and want him gone. Some of them hate Israel and want it gone. But a lot of them are people who consider themselves to be centrist or on the left, who basically sign up to all the values that the Israeli Supreme Court believes, endorses, and has enacted. And these are people, I'm talking about people in Britain, who believe that they would rather have a society governed by judges than politicians, because they think politicians are devious, liars, immoral, amoral, whereas judges are people like them who are upstanding and liberal and believe in human
Sounds
rights.
like they're half right. I think they may be right about the politicians, but judges can be just as bad, can't they?
Well, this is absolutely. But I mean, they're basically not, they don't actually believe in democracy. What strikes me about the democracy protesters on the streets of Tel Aviv is that they are anti-democracy protesters. They are basically saying, in terms, at the mildest, they're saying that the policy of the policy intention of the Likud to produce judicial reform cannot be allowed because they don't like it. Why do they like it? Because it's undemocratic. It doesn't occur to them that by saying that what they think should take precedence over what was produced by a democratic election, and I have no time for the Israeli political system, but put that to one side. It was, a properly constituted election, returning a properly constituted government. They think that by wanting to stop that government from enacting the promises it gave to the electorate, that is democracy. They also think that by going onto the streets and saying, bring it down, that's democracy. They think that, the mayor of Tel Aviv saying, what did he say? I can't remember the precise word, but something like, democracy leads to violence, or democracy always leads to dictatorship. And the only way you can get proper democracy is by violence on the streets. I mean, it's just like, what? This is ludicrous. So it's and I can see this pattern developing in the West. This idea that, our elected politicians are really awful. They're rubbish. They're stupid. They're venal. They're corrupt. All that may be true, but nevertheless, to say that therefore we will have no truck with democracy anymore. And in fact, we think that the power of the streets is where democracy should be. Now, this is the French Revolution all over again, because this is legitimizing anarchy, and out of this anarchy comes an abuse of power, which is far, far greater than anything that our venal politicians can produce. Because ultimately, our venal politicians, however venal they are ultimately answerable to us. Now, the problem in Israel is that they're not properly answerable to the public. Once they're elected, that's it. There's not a proper distinction between the executive branch and the legislative branch. There aren't checks and balances as we have in Britain, as you have in America. That's all true. Nevertheless, they are elected every 4 years, whereas the judges aren't elected at all. They're a self-perpetuating oligarchy. And the idea that can be more democratic than the other sort, than the elected sort, is to me preposterous. And when you peel it down, you don't have to peel it down very far, but you can hear what people are saying. The judges are people like me. I am liberal. I am open-minded. I am intelligent. I'm educated. I believe in human rights. I believe in the interests of the poor, and all of that. They look at the judges, they think they're like me. They look at these politicians, especially in Israel now, when they are, horror of horrors, religious, and they say, no, we can't have this. It's going to be a theocracy. Okay, Bezalel Smotrich says he wants a theocracy, but that's just him. And I don't see him having a great deal of clout actually at the moment, apart from maintaining Netanyahu in power. So this is all complete nonsense. So what I'm saying is there are a lot of people in the West who actually sign up to all this. So they sign up to this universalism. It's ultimately the fight in Israel. Ultimately, it's not judicial reform. Judicial reform is the kind of the focal point, the symbol, the embodiment of the actual fight, which is a fight between, on the one hand, universalism, universal values, and on the other, particularism, which is a nation and its particular culture. Now, in Israel, it's Judaism. That's its culture. But this fight between universalism and particularism, i.e., brotherhood of man versus the nation state, is the fight you're in America, it's the fight they're in here in Britain, and it's now on the streets in Israel. That's the fight that's going on. And it has to be won by the nation. It has to be won by the particular. Otherwise, we can just give up. The West is over.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I guess one of the common themes between the American left and the Israeli left has been their labeling of their political opponents as enemies of democracy, part of which is just gaslighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
As someone who lives in both the UK and Israel, you see the split in Israeli society between, as you just illustrated, the liberal elites appear bent on keeping the Mizrahi, the nationalist religious communities, out of power by the Supreme Court, and their ability to mobilize sort of business, legal, media, and academic establishments.
Yes, and the other thing that strikes me is, as in so much, what's going on here is a hijack of language, as we've just been discussing. The protesters claim to be protesting on behalf of democracy, but in fact it is the opposite of democracy. They are trying to effectively destroy democracy. And, we hear this all the time, this sort of inversion of language in all kinds of areas, certainly in terms of, the identity politics, race and gender. A woman isn't a woman. You can't be racist if you're a black person. All white people are racist and all the rest of it. And, in Israel, Israel versus the Palestinian Arabs, this is exactly the tactic that's been used. The hijack of language. So the Israelis who are, or the Jews who are the only people who have any moral and legal right to that land, are deemed to be colonizers. Whereas the Palestinian Arabs, who are Johnny-come-lately usurpers, who invented a national identity solely to destroy the Jewish one, they're considered to be, or said to be, the rightful indigenous inhabitants of the land. A complete inversion of language, which has produced a complete inversion of thinking and morality, and is part of the way in which the West has lost its moral compass completely. It can no longer distinguish between truth and lies, right and wrong, justice and injustice, victim and oppressor. It not only can't distinguish between them, it inverts them. And we see this over and over again, and we're seeing it in Israel on the streets, we're seeing it in our identity politics, we're seeing it in the 100-year war by the Arab Muslim world against Israel, against the Jews of Israel. And this is what's really, really frightening to me, because it goes beyond issues. This is a repudiation of, as you said before, it's like the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was supposed to be the age of reason. This is the age of unreason.
That is a discouraging note for us to end on, but nevertheless a true one. Melanie, thanks so much for joining us today and giving us so many important insights on the issues. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.